President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
Houston, we've had a problem.
Good evening, and welcome to Today in History. I'm Matt Datillo. Today is March 30th, 2010, and this is episode 437. I'd like to take a moment before we get started this evening and thank those of you who have either made a donation to the show, ordered a DVD of past episodes, or have sent emails of encouragement as we try to produce the 500th episode of this show before our May 16th 5th anniversary. I don't know if we're going to make it, but it's certainly going to be close. Today in 1855, a group of Missouri citizens invaded the Kansas Territory in order to ensure the election of a pro-slavery legislature. This act was only one in a series of actions, both violent and nonviolent, that would be called the Border War, or Bloody Kansas. This conflict became a microcosm of the tensions being felt in the United States as a whole during the decade of the 1850s. In that way, Bloody Kansas really marked the beginning of the U.S. Civil War. The trouble began in 1854 with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the legislation which created the two territories. It also overturned the Missouri Compromise of 1820 by stating that the question of slavery in the territories of Kansas and Nebraska would be decided by the territory's inhabitants. It was hoped that pro-slavery settlers would move to Kansas, and anti-slavery settlers, called abolitionists, would move to Nebraska. This hope came to fruition in Nebraska, where a majority of abolitionist settlers found homes. Kansas, however, was another matter. People on both sides of the slavery issue rallied their forces in order to ensure that their side maintained a majority in the territory. The abolitionist movement brought in people from as far away as Maine to settle in the area, while most of the pro-slavery settlers simply crossed the border from Missouri. There was a third party present in Kansas, the Free Soil movement. On the surface, the Free Soilers appeared to be an anti-slavery, and they were, but their main goal was to make the territory a whites-only state free of plantations, which they believed kept whites from land ownership. Violence quickly ramped up as settlers moved into Kansas. John Brown, who would later go on to greater infamy with his raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859, brought a group of abolitionists to the area with the expectation of an armed conflict. The conflict grew in 1854 and 1855 to the point where it had actually become a small civil war. Realizing that bleeding Kansas had national importance, a coalition of Whigs, Northern Democrats, and Free Soilers who opposed slavery formed the Republican Party. In 1860, a middle-aged lawyer named Abraham Lincoln would run on their presidential ticket. The state legislative election in March 1855 was rife with fraud. Over 5,000 people crossed over from Missouri to cast their ballots in support of a pro-slavery legislature. When the counting was finished, the number of votes cast exceeded the number of registered voters in the territory. Afraid of more conflict, Territorial Governor Andrew Reeder approved the election anyway. In 1856, a congressional committee traveled to Kansas in order to investigate matters there. It was agreed by all members that the elections had been fraudulent. Furthermore, the committee decreed that the will of the people was that Kansas should be a free state. President Franklin Pierce ignored the committee and continued to recognize the pro-slavery legislature. It is believed that 55 people ultimately died during the fighting in Kansas. The violence continued off and on until 1859, when a state constitution was finally approved that recognized the abolitionist view. It was approved by voters with a 2-to-1 margin. Kansas, a free state at last, entered the Union in January 1861, just 3 months before the beginning of the U.S. Civil War. That death toll of 55 is somewhat disputed. In fact, many numbers are now lower. If you lived on the east coast of the United States in 1855 and read the newspaper accounts of the events in Kansas, you would have been led to believe that the death toll was in the thousands. It was probably the most exaggerated story of its time, and would probably never be exceeded again. In fact, there were local papers in the Northeast United States that didn't even send reporters to Kansas, but were essentially making up stories based on hearsay from people who could be contacted locally who had traveled to the territories. Not that our reporting is always more accurate at this present time. That's it for this evening. If you'd like to get in touch with me, please feel free to do so. My email address is mattstodayinhistory@gmail.com. You'll find a transcript of this and previous episodes of this podcast at mattstodayinhistory.com, along with a donation link which serves two purposes. First, if you'd like to make a generous donation to the podcast, which is always appreciated, and two, if you'd like to order a DVD of all past episodes. The cost for the DVD is $20 U.S. in the lower 48 continental United States and $25 U.S. everywhere else. You'll also find me on Facebook. Please do a search for Matt Dattilo. That's MattDattilo. I'm the Matt Dattilo in the Louisville Network. Thank you very much for staying subscribed, and have a good evening. We'll talk again soon.